whenever you like. Okay.
Great.
We're
Okay,
recording.
so obviously what Plessner is doing at this point in the book is he's building up to the concept of eccentric positionality in chapter 7. And this is where he dives in more deeply to what he calls the closed form of organization, the animal form of organization. And the part that we've read for today is again kind of building up, because he gives us some more information, more descriptors of what is distinctive about about the closed form of organization. And then distinguishing two path that it is the prequel, what will eventually, that's the path.
Yeah.
Can you guys hear me all right? It's saying my internet connection is unstable. Am I breaking up? Okay.
It's lagging slightly.
I am breaking up?
Yeah, it's lagging every now and then, but it's not too bad yet.
I'm really sorry. Look, just stop me if it gets really bad, because
Yeah, sure,
and I'll just go back and I can look for I can use another connection if I need to, but it's a little bit of a hassle. So,
Okay.
So the centralized, of course, that path is the precursor of, or that's the path along which we will eventually find eccentric positionality as a distinctive type of centralized organization. In the second half of the chapter, he's going to draw some consequences of this analysis, particularly of the centralized form of organization, for things like intelligence, more on the way that the surrounding field appears. So the way that an environment appears to a centralized form of organization, or the centralized type of animal, and memory. Again, some sort of familiar topics, but he's going to come to those familiar psychological and philosophical topics through this analysis, or this account that he's been building of the essential characteristics of living beings, right? Organic beings. So in this first half, that's what I'm charged with trying to cover today, and I'll try to do it quickly. In this first half, I'll try to do it succinctly and informatively. In this first half, he again does three things. He describes some more of the sort of characteristic features of the closed form of organization, and then talks in more detail about the decentralized version of that, and then in more detail about the centralized version. So what are the features that he's telling us more about in the first of the three sections here? These are all features that help us to make sense of, among other things, help us to make sense of characteristics of our own experience. Remember that part of what he's trying to do with the whole book is to help to explain or provide a way of understanding human beings vis-a-vis life, the category of organism that applies to human beings as well, and do that in a way that avoids all of the problems of the traditional dualist frameworks and the insufficient alternatives that have been offered so far to dualism. So in this first section, he ends up talking about selfhood. He says that the closed form of organization is a self, but he says it's not yet an I. So there's some kind of reflexivity that has to do with the distinction between what is the part of the organism, the center of the center of the organism, or it's having a kind of center that is inside of its body, and whatever is inside of that center in relation to the boundary between the sort of center and the rest of the body. There's some kind of relation between the organism and its, in the case of plants. He describes this organism as having the closed form of organization as having a here-now structure. There's a kind of presentness. He describes it as spontaneous, as having the possibility of choice, and as having what something he calls frontality, which is a kind of objectivity, but it's not necessarily, there are sort of grades of objectivity that he's going to reconstruct. So like the decentralized form of animal organization has, in a way, has frontality, and in that sense has more of a kind of relation to its environment that is differentially responsive to the environment, that involves some kind of antagonism or directedness to the environment that's not present in the case of plants, as plants are more sort of geared into their environments without any kind of opposition. Plants are just kind of, they sort of like are built on and in and through the environment, but animals are opposed to their environments in some sense. There's a kind of correlation between the animal and the environment that involves some opposition and tension, and not just this kind of keying into. And that's the case even for the decentralized form of animal organization. But there's less of this opposition and mediatedness and kind of detachment or capacity for detachment in the case of the decentralized form of organization than there is in the centralized form. So the centralized form involves the capacity for more objectivity than the decentralized form. And then finally, when we get to the eccentric form, we'll see that it includes even more capacity for objectivity. So we're sort of building up levels of objectivity as we go through. And when Plessner describes this like here now structure or reflexivity, a kind of like basic reflexivity that is present even in a decentralized form of animal organization, which he also describes as like a self, I think there's a lot here that looks again a bit like Aristotle. It's almost like he's just again saying the organism works in a way that is space-like, time-like, rather than just spatial or temporal. It has a kind of future directedness. It has a kind of let me see if I can get a little bit closer to the text in this section. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because there's a lot more else to talk about. He talks about this alternation between I think actually I won't go in. I think if you guys want to talk about it in more detail, we can. Spontaneity is interesting and maybe a little bit more intuitive, easier to make sense of. The spontaneity is the idea that the animal organism, the closed form of organism, has choices or has this kind of that there's a sense in which what it does, there's a source of what it does, which is itself. What it does comes from itself, but comes from it, but what it does, and what it does is not entirely determinate. It's not just given by the environment. There's a kind of spontaneity or openness in what it does in relation to the environment, which means that that's a kind of Plessner's definitely saying that this is a kind of incipient choice. This is the precursor of even the kind of like reflexive, conscious choices that human beings make, that animals already have this sort of greater freedom of, or he says freedom isn't the right word, but this greater kind of like scope of possible reactions to their environment. Okay. So then at the end of that section, that first section, he considers an objection, which is basically this. He says, someone might worry at this point that I've just imported one half of the dual aspect. I've imported consciousness or subjectivity into my descriptions, that I've somehow shifted levels in describing animals in these ways, that I haven't built up to this in a kind of logical, deductive, stepwise manner, but rather I've just added this now, or I've just shifted gears. And he says, he said in his response, as I understand it, is there's something like, yeah, there's a reason why it might look that way, but what we've been, and part of why it might look that way is because we've been very careful from the beginning to acknowledge that there is some intuitive truth in the dual aspect idea. And we've been trying to kind of get behind that by reconstructing what the features of living things and intuition are. And now we're at the point where we're describing the types of living things that have this this dual aspectivity in a way that is very close to our own, that's very close to the kinds of things that we're familiar with regarding subjectivity and objectivity from philosophy, from the history of dualism. And there's a reason why we're familiar with those things, because partly we are the types of organisms that we are animal organisms. So he's basically saying, I have, okay, to put it really, really simply, and we need to get into more details, but the basic strategy is like, no, I haven't. No, I haven't just added it in. I've very slowly built us up to this to see where this thing comes from and how it's different from what we see, and how it's different in the animal case than what we see in the non-animal case, but nonetheless bears continuity with the non-animal case. Okay, so moving on then, the description of the decentralized and the centralized. So I'll try to move a little bit more quickly because I think we benefit from discussion more than a lot of what I might have to say about it. But the basic differences that Plessner seems to articulate here, I mean, like, obviously what he has in mind basically is the difference between an organism that responds to its environment through very individualized systems that pick up cues from the environment and then dictate a response, almost like reflexes. And so, you think about like animals without, like most invertebrates, animals without an elaborate central nervous system, where there isn't like, there's less consciousness, there's less of a kind of freedom or openness to making decisions, there's less memory, there's less capacity for learning. And so that, like, most invertebrates would go into that category. And then when we look at the centralized form of organization, we're looking at organisms that have a more developed central nervous system and whose behavior seems to be more a matter of learning or something like choice than it is a matter of like instinct or reflex. And where there's some kind of place where information from multiple sensory modalities is like compared or processed or somehow feeds into some kind of complex response to the environment. And some of the more, so that's the basic idea, which I think is kind of very kind of familiar idea to us. But then there are some more specific things that Plessner says that I think are interesting and are worth noting, which I will now briefly kind of point to a few of. One is that in the decentralized mode, Plessner says, the organism is organized by its action responses first, and sensation only exists to the extent to which it can guide action responses. So the action responses, the motor responses, are like the kind of driver. They're the key feature of the life cycle or the function cycle, functional circle, as Funktionkreis, as Buxkle had called it. Whereas with centralized organization, there's what he calls a primacy of the senses. So there starts to be this kind of shift from a motor first or motor primarily organization to a more and more sensation-based form of organization, which also means more and more of a representation-based form of organization. So it's more and more a matter of sort of building some kind of picture of the environment, building some kind of internal map of the environment, which means that in a way, for the more centralized organization, receptivity plays a greater role than activity. Another of the interesting things that he points to is how, as you have more and more centralization, you have more and more of a capacity for objectivity. You have more and more of a capacity for refined discrimination in the environment and kind of representation of the environment as a thing, as a kind of stable thing that one confronts and that one can react to in lots of different kinds of ways. And so there's actually a kind of very interesting correlation that Plessner is trying to kind of derive here through comparison between the decentralized and centralized forms of organization, that there's a correlation between centralization inside the organism, the kind of coherence of a subject. In Kantian terms, you could say the transcendental unity of apperception, right? The kind of greater, the more we have a kind of coherent subject or self, the more we have the capacity for a coherent, stable representation of an environment, or a coherent, stable sense of an environment, or maybe even better, a sense or intuition of a coherent, stable environment to which one can interact in multiple ways. So subjectivity and objectivity are being the sort of the relation between them that he's sketching here through this comparison between the centralized and decentralized, that the decentralized has more of both of these things. It's supposed to, in a way, be a kind of derivation of where objectivity comes from. It's supposed to be a kind of explanation of what that phenomenon is. And he says that this objectification occurs through something he calls the action field, which is a kind of representation, it's the organism's representation of its own possibilities for action. So the decentralized form of organization, even though it's guided by action, or sort of all kind of built on the action framework, the decentralized forms of organization, decentralized animals, don't represent their own actions. Their own actions are blind. They're in a way blind to their own actions. They just act. The acts that they carry out or their action responses are the kind of structural principle of their way of being and living, but they don't represent those things. Whereas as this sort of shift from motor primacy to sensory primacy takes place, the more sensory primacy organisms represent their own actions as part of their sensory field, as part of their as part of their receptor mechanisms. And that helps them to then gain control over those actions. So that with the centralized form of action, or centralized form of organization, those animals have more control over their own actions, or they have a greater scope of possibilities for how they respond to their environment. In part because they're like, and it's interesting because he doesn't quite mean the eccentric dimension yet. I mean, he's not saying that dogs do physiology, for instance, okay? But he's saying that a dog, think of a dog, for instance, is aware that if he wants to escape a predator or get a piece of food before another dog, that, for instance, he has a certain time window in which to do that. He's aware that that he may be able to get the food and escape the predator, or he may not be able to do that. So he's, in a way, kind of, he is using his own potential for action, for responding to the environment as part of the information that guides his decisions. Okay, but it's not reflexive in the eccentric sense. It's not like he's like, aware that that's what he's doing, or that he's able to sort of carry that out to a great extent. And it's actually, I think Plessner doesn't want to like make any commitments about what dog experience is like, right? But it's just that clearly the capacities for action and the sort of the motor responses are part of what is feeding into the representational and decision-making system of like a dog and other centralized animals. And that's part of what gives them a more elaborate environment. It gives them an environment which appears to them in terms of what J.J. Gibson might call affordances. It gives them an environment that appears to them as affording various possibilities for action, which is itself the basis for Plessner of a higher level of objectivity. It's the sort of like, it's the thing that lifts us from just frontality as such to something that is a much more, that we can call a kind of perception of objects and of a stable environment or external world that the organism is related to. And Plessner highlights as well, and I think it's so interesting how so much of this stuff is borne out by contemporary behavioral biology and evolutionary theory. But he notes as well that there's a kind of cost to learning, right? There's a cost to decision making, because if this greater scope of decision-making possibilities that the centralized form has, it involves a time cost at least, right? Because like if the decision has to be made in the moment, then that can be less effective than a programmed reflexive response. And so there's a sense in which the possibility of error has to also increase on Plessner's account in order for there to be greater centrality. So the decentralized organisms are, again, they're like plants in that they're more keyed into their environments, right, than the centralized form, which means that there's a greater kind of leeway between environmental cues and behavioral responses in the case of centralized organisms, which also means there's greater potential for error, there's greater need for selection. So these are some of the mechanisms that Plessner describes. I'll just point to two last items here, maybe three last items. So one is that in this discussion of the correlation between centrality and objectivity, there's an interesting note about, because this objectivity, what are objects? What is this stable environment that can be
I think you're frozen.
He's frozen, yeah, okay. Short break.
case of the
Okay,
sorry,
Phil, it
right?
interrupted
just
you.
Physical objects. It interrupted me, I'm sorry. Damn. Can you hear me now, okay?
Yeah, we can hear you now. But I
I'm
forgot
so
what you
sorry.
last said.
Oh,
Anyone
shoot.
remembers?
Did we stop with, were we talking, did you hear what I said about about
Objects.
the cost of learning?
Yeah, cost of learning, we still got it.
Great.
I think it stopped around objectivity.
About objects, okay, objects
Yeah.
and objectivity, right. So notice that Plessner began the whole book talking about physical objects having a kind of dual aspectivity, having a kind of like core periphery relation, right? Which was different from what living beings have. But he's talking about objects of intuition at the beginning of the book. And now at this point, he's able to, in a way, he says, derive that structure. He's saying that the centralized form of organization perceives its environment in terms of objects that have this core property structure, because the object, is known to the centralized organism as something that exceeds its grasp in some ways, right? That it's something that can be confronted from multiple angles, can be confronted in multiple ways, can be interacted with in multiple ways, but has a core that exceeds that of the what the organism perceives in it. So there's supposed to be a kind of derivation, I think, of that core property relation that was discussed at the beginning. He also, in discussing this centrality, well, in this section, he also talks a bit about the brain, about how this centrality is actually physically manifest in an organism. So he talks about the brain. You can think about like central nervous systems in general. And he makes an interesting point, which is, he makes a number of interesting points, which you guys may want to talk about more, but he spends some time laying out an argument that what is sometimes called proprioception, like perception of one's relation, one body's relation to the gravitational center of the Earth, or sort of the gravitational field, which is controlled in humans by part of the ear canal. But he talks a little bit about the like physiological mechanisms in different organisms, but that this is in a way the physical correlate of positionality. And he says but you have to remember, like both the brain and like the physiological source of proprioception, they're related to things like centrality and positionality, respectively, in the way that the physical is related to the living, or the way that the spatial is related to the space-like, the temporal is related to the time-like. So the point there is that there's a distinction between like what can be described empirically, or what can be described in purely physical terms, and what characterizes this mode of being of organisms as it appears to intuition. So that's fine. So there's a kind of physical correlate or match for what appears within Plessner's organic modals analysis, right? There's a physical correlate, which is the brain or proprioception responsive organs, but that doesn't mean that they're identified. Plessner doesn't want to say that like the center of the organism is its brain or its central nervous system. That would be too simple and would be ignoring this distinction between the empirical and the modal. Or the empirical and the categorical, or the empirical and the intuitive. And then finally, the last part of the chapter, which is the last part of my review here. And again, I apologize, I don't have a better organization, slides and so on. I know that that would be better off. And if any of you are frustrated, I welcome you to take over next week instead. No, but I'll try to do better next week. But the realism question is the last part of the chapter. And here Plessner interestingly says, be careful, you do not want to conclude either. From my analysis, he says, you cannot conclude, you cannot argue either that, oh, well, this shows that like an external world exists, or this shows that the environment of the centralized organism is a real thing, and it really exists in any particular way. And likewise, you can't conclude from it that it's not a real thing, that it's just a projection of the organism, which is something that Uxkall sometimes seems to argue. And Plessner explicitly disagrees with Uxkall on that. So he says basically, like, don't draw either of those conclusions. You can neither draw a realist nor an anti-realist conclusion from what I'm doing here. He says the organism, the environment of the organism, its surrounding field that it relates to positionally, is as real as the organism itself, and no more real. So if you were to say that somehow the organism's relation to its environment proves the reality of the environment, you would first need to prove the reality of the organism somehow, which you presumably could only do if you could prove the reality of something in your environment. So the point there is that this is all a structural analysis. This is all an analysis of the way that these things that appear to us in intuition are related to one another. If we start to try to understand the coherence of these things that appear to us in intuition, we see that, okay, we see there's a distinction between centralized and decentralized organization of animals, and we see that centralized animals have a more elaborate environment that appears to them. But all of it is within the framework of analyzing objects of intuition. It's all within the framework of this structural analysis or unraveling of categories of organic modals. So the whole process isn't. So now an interesting question, the last point, and then let's discuss. Let me be quiet and hear what you guys have to say. An interesting question is whether that will change by the time we get to eccentric positionality. Will eccentric positionality give us any resources for claiming greater confidence about the reality of anything, of the environment, for instance? Does it give us some kind of traction on the classic realism problem in philosophy or not? And I like to believe that it does, but let's see what we'll find when we get to chapter 7. At this point, Plessner is explicitly saying, don't draw those kinds of conclusions, because I think, yeah, again, if we want to read it my way, I would say, like, he just is saying, we just don't have the resources to do that. Yeah. So when we start thinking through eccentric positionality may give us more resources for doing it. And it might, the answer is probably not going to be as simple as like realism is correct or anti-realism is correct. It's going to be more complicated. It's about the relation between realist commitments and anti-realist commitments. Okay, or anti-realist doubts. All right, so that's enough for me. Thanks for letting me talk at you for a while.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I think you make Plessner sound a lot clearer than he actually is. So kudos to that. I wanted to maybe start off by torturing you a little more and ask you to because I think you have a very good overview of, after having read this work so many times, of the overall structure of the work. If maybe you could try to boil down his method throughout the work. What has he done up until this point? And this, if we can really, because I think it would benefit all of us to have this really clear picture. Okay, so first he has this historical analysis, then he has the Cartesian analysis, but then what does he actually do within his own method? If maybe you have a clear picture of that to share with us, that'd be very helpful.
You mean from chapter 3 on, basically?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I definitely can take a shot at that, but I'd rather maybe like hear 2 or 3 others try to take a shot at it first, if that's okay. If people want to talk about that, and if you have other specific questions about this chapter, we'll get them on the table too. I think it's a great question, definitely a great question, Primoz, but does anybody else want to take a shot at that or raise another question about specifics of this chapter? I think you learn something by trying to answer your question. Do you know what I mean? I think you learn something about how to read it by trying to answer the question. Whereas if I answer the question, maybe we don't learn as much. How would you answer it? Can I put it back to you?
Oh, damn.
What do you?
Now I've set myself up. Well, I have a lot of difficulties trying to keep it clear what exactly he is doing. But I mean, I'm reading it for like the 3rd, 4th time now, and I always get lost within the chapter. What's the overall track he's following? But I do think so. Yeah, we started at the point of determining living beings as beings that are objectively dual aspective, so they have an inner and an outer side. And how is this possible? We have the boundary, which is the feature of living beings which allows them to position themselves, and that's where the whole analysis of processuality of living beings comes in, and essentially all the other organic modals, as he calls them, which we can derive based on which we can deduce, as he says, from this feature of the boundary. And if we manage to deduce all these features, we have in a certain sense proven this hypothesis that the boundary is the essential feature of living beings that makes them these dual aspective physical bodies. And yeah, so I guess what we've been doing for the last 3 chapters is trying to build up one organic model after another, starting with just positionality as the kind of expression of the boundary, and then going into processuality. For example, the way I've been trying to explain it to myself is that when he talks about a process, we cannot think of a living being other than as something which is processual. It's a condition of the living being, and then we are building all the other categories, like in the last chapter. What was it? Reproduction, for example, which are essentially built up on top of those previous modals as a kind of and ultimately culminating in this description of the basic forms of life, which we are at now. We were right at the last chapter, but in this chapter we are dealing with the closed form of the living being. And the next step is, of course, radicalizing this, what we developed so far, to try to capture the nature of humans. So that's kind of my picture. But I'm not sure. I feel like it's difficult to say how the parts, the phases of this deduction fit together, how they lead from one to another. And that's why I would find it interesting if maybe someone else also joined in to try to describe what they've taken from this path so far. And now we have lost Phil H. So yeah, just feel free to join in. Do you feel like we've been going along some kind of a sensible path, or do you feel like it's very much meandering and unclear how this deduction is taking place?
I'm glad you posed it that way, because I have to admit I've had similar kinds of difficulties. It seems that he was trying to summarize a lot here on pages 224 to 225. And I wonder if just going over that might help us get some grip on this question. It seemed to me that would be, I would be interested in just working through that. And because he first of all says there's going to be a lot of objections here. I've suddenly smuggled in some kind of internal principle dualism of some kind, and I haven't really justified it at this point with all of this. And it seems to me he's trying to answer that point here, that does give a summary of what he's seeing. I don't know if anyone else has seen this, but let me just read over what he's saying here and see if we can make some sense out of this. He said, bit by bit, our analysis has been establishing double-sidedness as the double-sidedness of the bodily objects of intuition that can be considered to be alive. So in other words, he said he's established a double-sidedness as the double-sightedness of bodily objects of intuition that we consider, so organisms. And this is emerging clearly now, according to the original thesis. Living being appears to be in the dual aspectivity of the appearing thing, and as a thoroughly objective aspectivity of that. Now, the living being appears as a thoroughly objective aspect of that. I guess he's trying to say, this is how we experience or sense organisms. I'm just trying to understand this. Intuition can take a dual direction in relation to the thing, because the thing as appearing object is double-sided in a specific sense. It was by implementing this thesis that we were able to develop the objective characteristics of living things in context. And from the level of the essential characteristics forming the individual, we arrived at the organizing characters, and finally, the determination of these characteristics' specific differences. He seems to be trying to summarize what's been going on up to this point. And the open and closed forms. Here we find something remarkable. The closed form raises the existential level of the organized body. It becomes set apart from the body that it is, in the body that it is, so that it comes to stand above itself in the body as it is. In this distance of the core of the body's positionality, this setting apart of its space-time-like center, we gradually came to see the reason for its awareness. The core of the center, the positionality, has the value of a self, as in the phrase, the flower itself is the character of the subject of having. Now, I'm just trying to get clear. We've been establishing these dual aspects, he said, the double-sidedness, and that from gradually establishing that, beginning with what seems to be an empirical experience, we arrive at something remarkable. He says finally the closed form of one kind of animal body, which is the existential level of the organized body. I seem to be getting this distinction. I was just recently watching jellyfish, for example, in an aquarium. And what is it that's going on in a jellyfish? And it was, and I think he's trying to say there's very little centrality to this other than just a kind of nerve net operative, and how that is going to go into this more centered notion of the organized body, which is going to be the point that he's trying to bring out here in this chapter. And he feels that he isn't trying to smuggle something in. This is something that's coming to us through this analysis. I'm not clear, to be honest. I'm not clear still how we're getting there, but maybe someone can explain that. And Mike, do the others agree that there's something he's trying to summarize here for us that is important, that if we understand that, we might understand a lot of what his method is and where he's going.
Yeah, I had the same experience that he was trying to summarize something there, but I'm not quite sure whether I got the summary, like whether I got a clear picture from it, what he was really trying to do in that part. Because I feel like, yeah, he essentially just finishes by saying that by introducing this notion of the actual core, which the living being has, he is not introducing any new level, and that's basically introducing a new dimension in a certain sense, or like some kind of a mind spirit thing. But I mean, I guess you can just take him at his word. I don't know if feel free to join in.
I mean, I hear something like kind of a Spinozistic dual aspect view of a kind of monist view that has dual aspects to it, that he's trying to use that as a way of moving between Driesch and mechanism, and I think this is certainly something that's being discussed in some of the context in which he's in. But again, I'm grasping at trying to get really clear to be able to summarize to anyone else what this is actually saying. But maybe Philip has some insights here. I think you're muted. There you go. Yeah.
What passage? What are you referring to, Phil?
The passage 224, 225. It seemed to me that was in the.
Yeah, where he's saying the contra arguments.
He said there's all these objections, but this is the. But I'm answering, and this and this is what I'm trying to. And you mentioned that in passing, so this particular passage as well. I think you're muted, Phil.
Yeah, I think it's.
Sorry about that. That's the passage where he talks about. I'm just going to go get the book. I'm sorry, it's crazy. That's the passage where he talks about the here now, or right before that, where he's talking about the self, and he's sort of saying that these are not. These things are true simultaneously of the organism, that it's like beyond itself and is itself. Let me just, sorry, it's not very helpful. I'm just getting the book so I can actually look at the passage. Somebody else say something. Somebody else add some content here.
Well, where he's been saying, he says, bit by bit, our analysis has been establishing double-sidedness and double-sightedness. I'm interested in that contrast there, what he exactly means there, of the bodily objects of intuition. You're muted, Phil. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I wish I'd brought my German copy too, so I could see what double-sidedness is.
Yeah.
I have to go back upstairs and get. Does anybody have the German copy in front of them? What's double-sidedness?
So fortunately not.
I mean, I don't know, but I want to kind of fall back on a less specific understanding and just say that, you know, he's been trying to explain where the double aspectivity of living things comes from, and you know, explain it in terms of explain it in the form of a deduction. So like a Kantian deduction or a Hegelian deduction of categories. So he's trying to sort of say all of what, in a way that, like, a lot of the argument is in terms of conditions of possibility, or it's transcendental. It's like, if living things weren't this way, then we wouldn't be able to understand. I might actually get interrupted.
Yeah. Is he meaning something? I mean, fairly direct here and obvious. First of all, we experience organisms. I mean, organisms seems to have this double aspect. They both have in themselves some ability to act, and also they have in fitting into their environment as physical objects. We experience them, or this double-sidedness. Again, the German might help here. We experience them as having that. And he says, as the double-sidedness of the bodily objects of intuition, double-sidedness, and I have a feeling that that has something to do with our phenomenal experience of organisms, would be that they have this double-sidedness in themselves, and we have a double-sidedness in our experience of these. That's at least one way in which I might be able to understand what he's saying, and that so that he's developing some aspect there. But
I mean, I feel like what he's trying to say is that living beings do appear to us as though they have these two sides, but this is actually an expression of the fact that living beings actually manifest themselves objectively in these two aspects, because they do have an actual core, which comes to be represented ultimately in centralization in a very concrete form. But they also have this mantle of appearance, which they have this boundary through which they're trying to position themselves in the environment. Yeah. And so they're giving away, by virtue of their very being, this appearance of having this interiority and an exteriority. And I think we have a new member of the reading group. Perhaps she can bring her beginner's mind to bear upon Plessner.
She has both a centrality, and we have a double aspect view of her. Yes.
If you guys think reading Plessner is hard, try reading Plessner while caring for a 2-year-old.
Perhaps it's helpful to calm down every now and then.
Well, we're moving finally to where this book is taking us, to the realm of the human and eccentric positionality. So that's kind of an interesting introduction here to see that in the child as well as the adult. Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess the question at this point, and the criticism he's trying to address is, as we've said, when he is saying that living beings have this actual core, and this is what makes them double-sided, is he introducing dualism in effect? I think that's how I got this part. Have we suddenly wandered into a dualism? Is there some kind of an emergence of something extra to the physical analysis? And what he's saying is, no, we haven't introduced any such thing. We are just developing the basic categories from the notion of the boundary, and we haven't added anything at this point. But I'm not sure, how do you see it, the rest of you? Do you feel like something has shifted here? Has he shifted gears after all? Or should we or are we convinced by this deduction of his that nothing drastic has happened just because he suddenly started saying that by virtue of having an actual core, living beings are a self which possesses its properties and so forth.
Let me just ask, does this passage, I haven't checked it, but does it, the notion of core or center here, does it refer to the centeredness of particularly centered living beings that we've dealt with in this chapter, or living beings in general, as having a core internal to some boundary whatsoever?
Mm-hmm.
Because that, I think that's changes the content of this passage quite distinctly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that
I mean, I've been thinking, I've had some trouble like connecting the notions of centrality in this chapter to the previous points of the book. But the general point has been clear to me, like the way he tries to introduce like another fold into the living being insofar so as to get a kind of an internal perspective upon itself. So this, I think, is establishing a kind of ground for any kind of epistemological questioning of the living being, of me being able to question myself as a living being, right? Mm-hmm. Because I have a center that represents myself as a whole. So this kind of another kind of layer of dual aspectivity would be a dual aspectivity of a living being as such. And this is precisely something on the ground of which he's able to ground his own methodological perspective, right? Like that is how I would understand it. Was that at all clear, or was I just rambling?
Yeah, just trying to sort out my own thoughts.
One of the things I cheated a bit and read the very end, the appendix of the book, which he's added later, and I finally got a much more explicit feeling of his engagement with evolutionary theory. And this may help us if we can. I mean, he doesn't ever talk about this in these, almost never mentioned in these chapters, as if this is actually giving him a basic framework of some kind of analysis. I mean, this is in the sense that as we experience ourselves as both an inner and an outer, but with the continuity of life, with this evolutionary perspective, developmental perspective, then we can extend or at least reach back into the rest of life and see that same inner and outer without resulting in a dualism of mind and matter, or self and soul and so forth. And I begin to think that at least it might help us a bit to see that maybe this is where he's going, and that he's actually beginning phenomenologically with the experience of ourselves, and then we sort of see an extension into the rest of life of something about that is going to be considered to be non-dualistic and yet non-reductive in the materialist sense. And then we get to people like, begins to sound similar to Hans Jonas and some other people who have reflected on some of these same questions. But that's just, perhaps a way of understanding why he's developing things in this way and why he's going to be giving these kind of arguments. I can't say until we've read the whole book, but
I think you're very yeah, sure, go on, Timothy.
No, I want to add something to my own train of thought, but go ahead if you have a reply.
I just want to say that I think you are onto exactly what he. I wouldn't say exactly, but because we'll see how it occurs, and I've kind of forgotten the last chapter. But I think it is the point he makes in the final chapter when he's dealing with humans. The reason we are able to study life in the first place is because humans are being aware of the fact that they are a subject, because they are in relation to themselves. They can start to even dream of being able to separate themselves from the objective world. They are human beings, have objects in the proper sense of the word. And that's why we're able to do this analysis, which he is doing, by starting phenomenologically, looking at the living being in intuition, and just saying, okay, so we see that it has an inner and an outer aspect. Now let's try to postulate this boundary and see if we can develop all the features of living beings as we know them from this, and then we'll see if this initial phenomenological observation, this phenomenon, actually does justice to the actual nature of the human being, and of the living being in general, and consequently, of course, of the human being. And so yeah, I feel like essentially he's building up all along to come to this human part, so he can then reflect back upon all that he has been doing up to until this point, and say, so given the way humans are, this is what enables us to have gone onto this project in the first place, because we're able to establish objectivity by virtue of being truly true subjects, the true eyes in a self-reflexive, self-conscious relation to ourselves. And I think that is the basic.
That's where that's good, because I mean that's where the relevance of him being both at one time a student both of Husserl and of Driesch, I mean, a sense of avoiding some of the difficulties in Husserl, which seem to tend to subjective idealism in some ways, but nonetheless having that fundamental kind of phenomenological starting point, which a description of the phenomena, in fact, as we experience it, might be a way of uncovering them, as you're suggesting, and maybe giving us some kind of sense of where this is going and why we've started in the way we have, and why we're working up to this particular kind of analysis at this point.
Yeah, it's a very weird, I think, unusual procedure, the way he goes about this. Like I feel like most philosophy of biology starts with the physical living being, at least in the modern discussions, and then tries to, for example, autopoiesis starts with the cell and then tries to develop based on the cell in a kind of objective sense. Basically putting this, bracketing away this subjective dimension, whereas Plessner actually starts with this subjective dimension to eventually return to harken back to the physical world, and basically try to show us in this process more or less successfully that there really is, that we have to think differently about the division in the first place between the subjective and the objective world. And what are the conditions of being able to even penetrate through our subjectivity to some kind of a thing in itself, although it never really is the thing in itself, because of we are still caught in our consciousness. In a sense. You had something to add, Timotei? Go ahead.
Just to clarify my previous questions for the others, what I had trouble with is previously, when dealing with living beings in general, Plessner describes this dual positionality in terms of the distinction that separates the organism from the environment, right? And now he's shifted his perspective somewhat. I think when describing the structure of the animal as centered, is this really a center of this kind of boundary? Does this organism still distinguish itself actively from the environment? Is this center something that actively stands in relation to an outer environment, or is there another layer? He says explicitly that we have to now account for the dual structuredness of the animal itself. You have this inherent center and this outer periphery, which I guess, it's an open question how concretely to think about it, but I would say, I guess that, one way to see this would be in terms of the central nervous system and everything else, or perhaps the sensory motor mechanisms would somehow constitute this periphery, and then you would have some central processing units that controls the underpinnings of behavior or something like that. I'm not really sure, but in any case, you have this distinction. But is the center here still the center of a kind of of an organism distinguishing itself from an environment? That would be the basic question for the others.
I mean, I would say to this that there can be no organism that doesn't distinguish itself from the environment as well as connect itself with the environment. Plessner constantly emphasizes that we have to avoid thinking about the boundary as a kind of just a mere distinguishing from the environment. It doesn't merely separate us from the environment, but also connects us. And I think that we haven't lost this part. So even when we're dealing with the animal, the closed animal form, we still have an organism which has a boundary. So it is in this relation of separation and connection simultaneously. Bye, Phil. See you. And we also have a being that is positional. It is positioning itself into the environment and simultaneously into itself. But now what gets added is that this core that I think we can say already the plant in a certain sense had it gets very concrete. It becomes manifested in a physical part of the organism as a center, as a central nervous system in the animal form. And still this center basically merely adds to the discussion the fact that now there is a self, a center which is doing this connection and separation from the environment. So I don't think there's been any stop to this connection. The center is merely because it represents the body in itself. It is merely the factor which allows the animal a certain kind of awareness of this process of positioning itself into the environment and into itself. That is my reading. Did this answer your worry, or is it still unclear?
No, I mean, it answers it quite well. I mean, I'm still, I mean, I can see the logic behind this, and I guess it seems sensible to say, like with Plessner, like that, yeah, the boundary, the periphery of the animal still plays in a functional sense the same role as the boundary, like as a set, the role of a cell membrane. Like it insulates it from the environment in a dynamical sense, in that it counteracts perturbations, you could say, right? So in this sense, it's functionally still the same boundary, but of course it's more complex. Like there's more going on internally with regards to the structure of the organism. But my question was, can we still treat this periphery of a centered animal as the same kind of boundary, following the same basic principles as the boundary bounding, like I said, the simplest, most rudimentary life forms, such as a cell? That was my question, and I think you understand. I think I'm beginning to see the why one could argue in this direction, like why this would make sense, at least in principle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think he touches on the notion of cell membranes in the appendixes. There's a lot of interesting stuff in the appendixes that he just throws on, and he says that the cell membrane is the thing which allows life to form, but it is not the thing we are looking at when we're looking at a living being. And I'm not sure. I've mentioned this before, and I may be overemphasizing this distinction. But I think we have to constantly remind ourselves with Plessner that we are still working with intuition. So we're basically looking at a living being as it is given to us in a very general sense. And this is the level at which the boundary appears as part of this intuitive phenomenon. It's not the skin, it's not the cell membrane, it is merely the structure of this phenomenon of life, which is given in such a way as to present itself as though it has a boundary. Whether there's a measurable, concrete, cellular, biological, material substrate or something to this boundary is not really the thing we're dealing with here. So I guess Plessner probably wouldn't like this word if I used it in this context, but the boundary is basically something abstract, but it is not actually given to ourselves abstractly, because intuition is very much concrete. When you see a living being, you see this boundary as part of the living being, and you can't reduce it to some material aspect of the living being. So I think very much the boundary of the simple cellular organism, for example, like a unicellular organism that he also mentioned several times, is the same boundary as the boundary of the complex vertebrate animal, which also has a center which makes it a self, which is kind of the and allows it to experience from inside out this life of a being with a boundary that has to position itself.
But he seems to make some important distinction. Say if we're looking, I like to look at examples, but if we're looking at a colonial invertebrate, that the question he says here, where we've simply decentralized, some notion of a closed center, and what we have is we have some sort of sense of boundary on this, but that's very different than an organism which would be, he said, closed in that positionality, the closed boundary, and this would be the, to look at a bird is to see something very different than to see a colonial invertebrate, and I think that's that distinction is important that he's making here, and so it's the latter that is. He said one just sort of moves in the direction of automatic response. The other one begins to interact with its environment and have certain kind of internal action with it, and so that seemed to me to be important distinction in trying to get hold of this notion of what do we mean by boundary, and would it be the same as in a cell as in a bird or something of that kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, I guess that's what Timothy was also getting at, that trying to capture this difference of how the different manifestations of the boundary as the forms open and close.
Yeah.
And essentially, I guess it's expressed in how the organization of the living being is changed. It has a boundary in both cases, but it organizes itself within this boundary, or by the laws of this boundary is maybe a better way to put it. This is what changes. Susanna, if you have any thing to add, go ahead. Like, what did you find fascinating about this chapter?
Well, I don't have any comments about what you were discussing. That's why I was silent. But I keep. Can you hear me well? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. I still have this. I'm stuck in the notion of representation. Like last time, Seb was telling us that like it doesn't seem like it's a kind of representation that we talk when we, like, in activism criticizes representations and everything. But I agree with him last time, but now I see like it's exactly this notion of representation that he's talking about. Like, for example, in page 238, that it seems like he's describing like this representational theory of mind. Like we should nevertheless not conclude that this method of spatial localization is entirely foreign to what it's meant to represent. Method and object, brain, and the world of things correspond to each other, particularly in the spatial and temporal terms, albeit of course not in the measurements. In a certainly highly simplified form, the brain as a thing in space and time presents a small image of the surrounding field with the things in it. So like there are other parts of it, but I don't know, like I keep thinking that now he like kind of like in positional term, like in space and time terms, like it's the brain that represents the world, but I'm not sure if I'm getting it right.
I had the same experience as you did, because I also, at the same time that I was reading Plessner for the first time, I was reading through all the Varela articles and Maturana, and you had this constant emphasis on not this non-representational view of cognition. But at this part, I feel like he pretty much is making a representational view of things. He is maybe not ascribing particular importance to this aspect, like saying we should focus on this fact of how the brain represents. It puts little images of things in its space. But I'm not sure if there's a huge difference. Maybe Timothy, I think, also deals with this notion of representation a lot. Do you feel like he is a representationalist?
Whether who is a representationalist?
Plessner.
Plessner. I mean, I remember from this chapter where he explicitly says that he will not be dealing with this issue, and he says that he will deal with it later on somewhere. Like he says that it doesn't matter for his arguments here whether the brain actually represents, like pictures something existing independently out there, or whether it just codifies some principles of interactions with the environment. So that would be the issue, right? You were pointing at.
He says this in the beginning of the chapter, and then at the middle of the chapter where this week's section ends, he basically starts to lay out his theory of the brain as a representational organ.
Yeah.
Oh, he does. Okay, I completely missed that point.
No, there's no problem.
So,
and I
so
think
sorry, just go ahead.
Yeah, for me, like you said, it's not really important, but I think it is important because, like, he starts at the beginning saying that the representation, like, one central part is that the center represents like the organs, and then the organs represent and then, like, he comes to say that there's a correlation between, like, this inner representation and the outer representation in, like, center organisms. But so I think it is like a basic a central theme in this centralized path.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that somehow related to what Phil was saying at some point in his presentation, where he said that, like, the structure, the inner structure of the organism, the centeredness of the organism, one could understand it along the lines of Kant's, like, what's the term?
Transcendental unity, perception.
Yeah, the unity of our perception.
Yeah.
And that this somehow relates to the identity of the objective structure of the organism's environment. Like, the more you have, like, a inner centeredness, inner unification of your own structure, the more you can somehow impose this unity on your environment. That was the way I understood it. But this still doesn't really explain to me how the representation actually takes place and what the relationship between these two types of unities are. That's where I lost him.
Yeah, the thing is that he really drives home this point that the brain is a spatial thing, and it represents things, and consequently also representation is spatial, and there are these little simplified images of things which are represented in the brain, and I'm not sure how to square that with the classic representationalist theories, whether this is there's some subtlety here which I'm not getting, or is he just saying, yeah, the brain does represent things, and that's the way it is. I mean, he does make this point of the co-determination of environment and subject. He's not just saying that the organism just takes in the world as it is in some kind of objective form. I think that is a refined point here, which also squares from well with Varela, who constantly talks about mutual specification. So I think that this refines his notion of representation quite a bit. Maybe kind of puts away the more problematic parts of representation as just kind of a downloading of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, one way to add some, to what you were saying is that, I mean, representation, I guess what he was she's trying to say with the speciality of representation is just that there must be some sort of imprint. I mean, you must be able to find some sort of imprint of the world on the brain. But that doesn't mean that it has to picture anything pre-given. Like, at least that would run against some of his other claims for me. Specifically, the claim that objectivity, the unity of any kind of perceived object, isn't you can't find the unity in the perceptual qualities of the objects. There must be some sort of a structuring going on here, and this structuring isn't something you could download. You could just take up from the outside, right? So this has to be some there has to be a kind of active imposing of some structures. That the imposing doesn't have to be totally idealistic, totally determinate from. It's not just the organism. There could be like some sort of input from the environment, but the structure itself is I think there's some passages where he's talking about like the unity of the object actually has to be a kind of a dynamic unity of interaction between, like, sensory motor interaction with the environment. When you have a kind of a stable pattern of this kind of interaction, then you can speak. There you will find a kind of a unity, a boundness of some of perceived objects in the world. Like this is the structure of objectivity as such, right? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, what I was trying to say is that for me, this points to a very, very limited kind of representationalism. I mean, I really wouldn't call that representationalism at all in a kind of a modern sense.
Okay, have we saved Plessner, Susanna? From the evils of representation?
Yeah, let's see how it progresses.
Let's see how. I'm going to have to sign off here in just a minute. Maybe we can.
Yeah, sure.
Been a very good discussion, and thank you for. I'm sorry I missed the last one, but I think we're getting into the where it's all going. I think it's going to be interesting to see how he's pulling all this off when he reaches the sphere of the human, which is going to be an interesting.
Yeah, the last chapter is what interested me personally the most all along while I was doing it, because the theories I actually arrived at Plessner by way of another Slovene philosopher, and he was dealing with similar concepts. The thing is that once you've gone through the final chapter and gone over the honeymoon phase, oh yeah, so this explains the human and all its manifestation and aspects, then you started to wonder, but did we arrive at this point in a convincing way? Is the deduction actually solid? Is the boundary really the basis? And I'm constantly shifting between this. Okay, this is just complete nonsense. Some of the parts of this book are incomprehensible, and so I don't really know how the deduction was going on. But on the other hand, if you try to be really charitable and try to get into Plessner's frame of mind, really working in this intuitive method or deduction, rather than trying to approach what he's saying through the classic approaches, even through in activism, just trying to bracket everything away that you know from the different traditions, then I feel like he's really getting at something. He's describing life in a way which I personally, though I've not read so much philosophy of life, have not encountered before. He's really trying to approach life from a different perspective and developing these different categories of how, for example, animals experience their world in a pretty fascinating way. And then if we would manage to establish that this deduction is solid, I think there's something very beautiful in this project of his, which doesn't reduce life in any way, because it really builds up in this very compassionate way, I suppose I could say, empathetic way of
Yeah, it seems the big question he's really trying to deal with, which we're dealing with in our own presence. First, on one hand, we have evolutionary explanations of virtually all things human, offered by sociobiology and so forth. And then we have highly reductive explanations offered in terms of molecular biology, biophysics, and so forth. That those don't really actually often seem compatible with one another. And then we also have the experience of being human, which doesn't seem to be adequately dealt with by either one. And I think that that's where, to me, that's where Plessner is somewhat interesting. And coming out of this soup of Driesch and Husserl and Erskine, and with the background in Kant and Schelling and so forth, I think there's some interesting insights here that are maybe worth the work. So anyway, I'm going to have to sign off, and thanks to all.
Thanks for being here.
Take care.
Bye.
So the two of you, do you have any more things, or are you in a hurry as well? Should we finish, or do you want to add anything? And we can keep discussing. Don't feel rushed in either way.
I have a question regarding consciousness. Like, as I was not sure if he was like he says that in this decentralized forms of organization, they are like, they suppress the possibility of consciousness. But I don't know if like it is also regards to sentience, or how is consciousness understood here, like this kind of possibility, like visualizing the possibilities and seeing things outside of objects, or it's like sentience in general, like they say that they don't represent the body, and I don't remember the exact words, but it wasn't that clear to me, like what consciousness in this sense mean, that is suppressing decentralized forms of organization.
Yeah, let me just find this part.
Like I was thinking, like for example, the octopus, like this kind of reduced consciousness and decision and everything. Like an octopus is a decentralized form, right? Could it be a kind of example of this decentralized form?
I have no idea. No idea. Does it have a central nervous system?
It does, but it's a much more decentralized central nervous system. Like it possesses, like I think, a third of its neurons in its tentacles. So it's kind of something in between.
This intermediate form. Okay.
So but can there be intermediate forms? That's the question, because he says that life has to. Does he?
Yeah, he talks about the intermediate.
Because I feel like he tried to make this point that life either chooses the decentralized form or the centralized form, and that's
but he also says like that there may be variations in between, like it has to choose along a continuum. I think that's his point.
I'm going to find this in my notes right now.
We can talk more about that like next session, but I was curious about the notion of consciousness.
I guess I was also thinking about this because it struck me like the notion of consciousness was introduced it wasn't really introduced, it was just thrown in there. And I was always also perplexed as to what exactly he wants to denote by it and say in that passage. Like, I mean, if you understand it in terms of Kant's like unity of a perception, then that statement becomes almost a tautology, like more centralized types of living beings must possess more centralized consciousness. Like consciousness is the centralization of living structure. Like that's one way to think about it. I'm not sure if it's correct. That's just a way I've been trying to deal with this issue.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree that we arrived at consciousness with the appearance of centers, because centers are the condition that allows living beings to have anything, to be given anything. Essentially, it is like a reference point in the organism around which these things around which its body and its
Mhm.
environment, which is seen as its positional field, are gravitating. And at the moment of when this, because we have in a certain sense this already in plants, a kind of center, but it's not very much expressed there. Whereas in animals, we have this very concrete representation of the body and of the, by way of the body, of the environment within the organism. And this is because of this representation in the central organ, we can say that an animal has consciousness. And but according to this line, yeah, the octopus thing would be interesting. Like, I mean, or any kind of animal which doesn't have a real kind of center, because there's no center to which everything can be given in a certain way. It is decentralized. There are, like, I mean, for example, if we have the regions of a state, and they are not connected to any kind of central thing, there's no real consciousness that all this could be given. There's no capital in a certain sense. There's a region here or a region there that sort of work, but to really have a consciousness and to have this this unity and to be able to be possessed by anything, you need a center. And in the animals, this is their concrete center of nervous system.
He talks about like the kind of federalization or something like that you were talking about. He talks about like the unity of plan, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that because like that kind of connects like these different kind of, he doesn't talk about inputs, but like these separated things that a decentralized form of life receives or perceives or senses. Like he talks about like there's no unity there, but there's like a unified plan or something, but I didn't get it neither. Like a body plan, or like there's something that unifies.
Yeah, I think he uses like a dozen terms for this throughout the work. Like there's also Lebensplan in the German, I think, and there's the Gestalt type. And it's not clear how, in what relation are the Gestalt type or the Gestalt idea with this unitary plan and this, or the unity of the plan or whatever. I think he's not very careful with the terms here, or I'm not careful with the reading.
But right now, I've become really perplexed with this question. Like, what actually is it about the central nervous system that is central? Like, what is the centeredness of his center? Is it topological, or like, I guess, but it's about all the different stimuli or inputs from the environment are channeled into some central point, or but that doesn't seem to be it. Exactly.
That's how I interpret it. It is simply I think the English translation uses the passing through. Is the point through which everything passes. So
is there something he says explicitly, or
he says something to like this? Let me find it. Yeah, for example, when he's talking about the here now character of centralizing kind of being. Yeah, he says that when you have this reference point, the animal is here and it is now, and through this here and now, everything about it is passing through in a certain sense, and that's how I don't want to use computer metaphors, so I'm trying to look for other metaphors, but I would say, yeah, it's the place where the body's references in a certain sense are kept.
But there must be another sense, because I think what's also important for him is that the central part somehow captures the structure of the whole, like it represents the whole. It's a part of the whole that represents the entire system, the entire living being, right? So this is a different sense, I think, because it doesn't really, like your metaphor of a central processing unit is a good entry point into this problem, because it captures the channellessness, the central point of multiple channels, but it doesn't capture that aspect. Like the central processing unit doesn't represent the entire computer. It doesn't have any. And in that sense, I think it's the center for Plessner is also important in a dynamical sense. Like it's not just the here and now of some moment of consciousness, but it's also a kind of the central part of your like existential being, which you are trying to preserve through time. Like what constitutes you as a kind of individual being. And like I don't know. I don't know if this is actually actually what Plessner is saying, but I thought like the thing that was interesting for me is that this may be a way of discrimination between like the essential and the unessential parts of the organism. How it's not only preserve itself all the time, but also manages to be quite plastic in what it's actually preserving, like what its identity at any given moment could be, right? So this would be like the way your centeredness discriminates between what is actually essential to your personality, I mean to yourself, and what could be changed, what could be lost or replaced over time.
Yeah, but I don't know if you read the, I think it's the 4th chapter where he's going on for pages and pages about the processuality, the way the living being is always ahead of itself and is always maintaining in itself what it was in itself, all the mumbo jumbo. I think that part might answer what you're trying to get at here, but I don't quite have the answer. I just wanted to add one thing about at this point where we're at. I don't think we can say that the living being represents itself to itself as a whole. It merely represents its body. It has this lived body, and that is what is given to it, and the environment. But the environment at this stage is very much a product of this body, which the animal has difficulties divorcing itself from, especially so if it is not centralized, because then essentially the environment is just a field of signals for its actions. So, but it doesn't yet have this representation of itself as a whole, because that is the next stage where you begin. The animal has a body and has an environment, but it doesn't have this having. It doesn't yet have this reflexive relation to what it is doing, and that's the part of the last chapter where he goes into eccentric positionality, and essentially where the human is able to take not merely be centered and to have this body and its environment represented by way of a central organ, but also to be able to take a relation to this centrality, to this center.
So would it be like something like the difference between being itself in the self that it's not yet an I, and then like being to itself in the case of being an I?
I mean, in the case of humans, you definitely have an I. You have a distinct subject to whom all that this subject, this whole, all that this whole is doing, and all its very different forms, and all that it is given to the subject, and also the subject is given, of course, to himself. And I think that is essentially what he will call an I. So yeah, those are interesting developments later on. And I just had some. If you feel free to keep discussing, I just had some interesting notes here. Yeah, I just wanted to add that I'm very much fascinated by, like I said before, by the perspective he is describing things from. Because I feel like, in a certain sense, although he is not really getting into the animal's mind, he also is getting into the animal's mind. I mean, he's describing constantly just what we are seeing, and at the same time, you get like he is reconstructing the psyche of animals, and I think that's something most biologists today don't really dare to do. Like he himself says, we don't. It's better to stay behavioral or just study the anatomy or the physiology, but the psychology of animals, that is off limits, because we cannot get into the position of an animal. But he is actually kind of trying to sneak his way and reconstruct the animal perspective on the world. For example, when he's talking about, maybe this is maybe on another point, but I remember I was reading the part where he's talking about error, and how error increases the more the animal represents itself and feels itself separate from its environment, the greater the room for error is. And I remember when I was reading this, I was watching my cat sitting on the bench, and then it jumped down and it kind of failed. it just stumbled on the ground. And I think that's an interesting observation. Can animals that are decentralized, like, what would be an example of an animal making an error on a lower that is not decentralized, that is decentralized? Because, okay, so yeah, my cat jumped down because it has this gap between its sensation and its action, and so it can fail because it has to kind of figure out this crazy world around it, and sometimes it doesn't do it well enough. But what would be nice if we gave an example of how a decentralized animal does not make an error? How does this express itself? I mean, I don't know, maybe if you have any ideas to this or anything else.
I mean, for me, the possibility of error would be based primarily in the temporal gap between some sensation and some behavioral response. Like, whenever the behavior is temporal, then there's a possibility for error. So I guess the question would be whether the decentralized beings are even capable of that sort of temporality, where, like, temporality not just in the sense that they do things over time, but that you can discern some plan, like some sort of desired effect on the part of the organism. Because when you say that your cat failed, you presuppose that the cat itself had some sort of preconceived notion of what it wanted to achieve, like the end which it didn't succeed in attaining, right? So that would be, I guess, just another layer to add on to your problem.
But in what sense, like immediate response, like prevents the organism from error? Like,
I mean, I wanted to say only that if you don't have a plan, if you don't have a desired effect already in mind when starting some course of events, then you cannot fail by definition. You cannot be set to fail. You're just doing whatever you're doing. You don't have any criterion of success of action, right?
Well, getting poison instead of food.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could discuss whether there's, like, on what level the criterion is even manifested. Like, you could say that you have conscious criteria, like people have very explicit criteria which they are aware of what they want to achieve. But then for, like, simpler form of animals, you could just say that they embody certain criteria, right? Like they embody the drive to stay alive, and whatever they die, they fail in a sense, right? But that's actually like a complex issue for me. Like, on what ground could you attribute a teleology in that sense to something that doesn't really explicate any desired effects?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I'm not sure if he addresses that directly. Like this, how does he judge when an animal is failing? How do I know the animal failed? The cat fell off the bench and didn't intend to do that, because then yeah, that's just my conception as an observer that the animal probably wanted to land smoothly or something. But I mean, he talks about why the probability of an error increases is because the animal simply has the more options present to it. It has because it is sensing more. It has more of an environment full of different things which it could potentially have to react to or want to pursue, and they're not really just uh, the signals for their needs. They can also be kind of just there in a certain sense. So yeah, you have a much more complex world, which the animal has to kind of negotiate between this after it has kind of scanned the environment, what to do about it. But I guess the question you're asking, Timothy, is what determines what the animal actually wants to do in a certain sense. What is its plan, and how where does this fit in?
Yeah, I mean, a multi-layer centered organism could have multiple plans, which wouldn't necessarily have to be in unison, right? So there you would have, it's questionable whether that would even constitute an individual organism in that sense. But yeah, it could have processes which don't possess any single criterion of success or failure because they are individually separate.
I guess we have to refer to the bit where he's talking about the spontaneity of animals, in a certain sense, that we don't really know what animals are going to do. And I guess this is a feature of life in general. There's a bit of arbitrariness to what life does. You can't just mechanically predict where it's going to move. At least that's how it appears to us. Sure, the physicists might eventually manage to predict everything, but the way life appears to us, it has this spontaneity. And I guess in a centralized animal form, this becomes even more pronounced, that you can't really tell, but I guess you can still presume that if the animal has more options and has to operate on more variables in a certain sense, there's a greater likelihood that it will not manage what it sets itself to do, regardless of what that might be. We can't really tell it what it wanted, but just structurally speaking, it's very likely that it's likelier that this will happen as compared to a decentralized animal, which basically has a signal present directly in the environment. Like if we compare this to affordances, the affordances of the decentralized animal would basically not be just things there that afford, but basically force the interaction which are meant to represent in a very direct sense. And another thing that I'm have my eyes on right now is this interesting point where he says that consciousness, I don't know the exact English wording, but consciousness kind of works to keep away the body. No, the living being kind of works to keep the consciousness of the body away as long as possible. So that's in a certain sense, it tries to delay the becoming conscious of your body. And I'm not quite sure what to make of this point. Like, what does it mean? What is life? How is life doing this? Well, is he talking on an evolutionary level? So yeah, evolution is going to weed out the more animals that are decentralized or something. Or how can life keep consciousness away? Or is he just being metaphorical here? Because I feel like sometimes he's trying to be really precise and make a big note about being this precision of terms. Then he talks about consciousness keeping the life keeping the consciousness of the body away from its notice in a certain way. Yeah. I mean, how could life do this in its very general sense? Are we in some kind of German idealism or something here, where life is just this the spirit developing itself logically? It's yeah. If you have any other thoughts, any other things that aren't clear, we've got a couple more minutes before time runs out. I feel like sometimes it's easier to get to this specific topics when there are less people because it's easier to focus on something that it doesn't get spread out so much.
I can't find. I also like stopping that that part that you were referring to, but I can't find it now.
Let's just let me see. I can give you the exact page. I think I had it.
Like I think also like my question about consciousness and sentience was also related to that. That in this decentralized forms, like it's not related to if he's referring to evolution or anything, but about how like the representation or like consciousness of one's body, like it's delayed or something. So in that will deny kind of sentience to some organisms, like but by not being able to be conscious or of their own body.
That's a good question. Like I don't know where sentience comes in here.
He doesn't talk about sentience, like he talks about sensation.
Yeah, I know, and I don't know how I would. Where would I find the place for sentience? Where does it emerge here? Is it the emergence of the central system? Is this the emergence of sentience and there's nothing before? Is it? I mean, because also the decentralized animal probably feels it has a. I think it does have in his theory like it senses the environment. It's just not
the environment, but not the body, right?
Like, yeah, but it doesn't sense it doesn't represent itself, its body to itself.
Yeah.
But it does sense things. Yeah. It's just that sensation is permeated with its actions so much that it's pretty much subservient to action. Where in the centralized animals you have the separation in a really clear sensory motor spheres of functioning. But yeah, does a decentralized animal? I actually hate this term decentralized. I don't know. I don't know if it's the same in German, but I feel like I've said this before. It would be much more precise to say non-centralized, because it has not central. It wasn't centered at some point, and then it decentered itself. It simply isn't centralized. Yeah.
Not yet centralized.
Not yet. That'll be his kind of way to put it. The not yet of decentralized.
Oh no, but it's a different path, so it will never be like centralized, right?
Yeah. That's true. That's true. Yeah, we're getting into Plessner now.
I one final thought that it was like very speculative, but I found something interesting about like the way he describes consciousness, like in page 227, like reminds me of the way Sartre talks about consciousness. Like it's he says the sphere of consciousness spans, well, noticing is equivalent to inhibited excitations, affecting to this inhibited excitation. The sphere of consciousness spans these two poles, and it is here that the transition takes place from noticing to affecting. This sphere is thus the space-like inner boundary, the time-like interval between what comes from without and what goes out, the hiatus, the void, the internal chasm through which the response follows up on the stimulus. I don't know, this void and this like not being yet that Sartre talks about when he talks about consciousness, like where freedom, like it's like way too into the humans, but like this existential part of this consciousness as this hiatus that breaks, and there's nothing that determines. I don't know. I'm just
interesting.
Maybe I don't know if there's some influence from Plessner to Sartre, but
I doubt it very much. Plessner doesn't seem to have influenced very many people from what I've been reading. I think he has had some influence on Hans Jonas,
really? Okay.
but Hans Jonas never paid credit to Plessner, as far as I know. I was reading some part of a book that basically kind of criticized Jonas for not kind of paying his due, because there's this notion of, I think I've never really studied Jonas in detail, but there's this notion of life recognizing life, is that the life has this ability to be able to recognize it. This is basically a Plessnerian notion. This is what I was saying before in answer to Philip's thoughts on this matter, that it is life when it becomes eccentric that is actually able to think about the concept of life in the first place, to be able to recognize things or objects as living objects. So there is probably some influence in that regard. But Sartre, he does say, Plessner does say that Sartre reads as though he had read him, I think. He makes this point about Merleau-Ponty as well, that they both kind of read similar to what he's been saying. I think he's being a little bitter there. They're getting more recognition. But I guess they are working, what Sebastian would say at this point, is they are working in a similar tradition, in a similar spirit, and everyone's... Sorry, what?
Thought style, that's what Sebastian would say.
Yeah. And you have the Husserlian bit and the Heideggerian influence somewhere on the parallels, which Plessner is trying to kind of, I think, bypass and develop his pretty unique take. I mean, he often has these moments where this existential language enters his description. One moment he's being very, I don't know, scientific and biological, and then suddenly there's this talk of hiatuses and chasms and that stuff, voids, and this is going to make more sense, I think, when we get to the human part, because I guess what we could say is the reason he uses this kind of existential language, which seems to belong more to the human sphere than to the sphere of the animal, is because we are still looking at, as we've said before, at the phenomenon of life. And we can't quite remove ourselves completely from it. We kind of read these things into it. I'm not sure if his idea is to try to avoid that. Why is he allowing this to happen quite often? Why is he not being more, okay, I shouldn't use this kind of language here? Because at other points where it makes the text much more difficult to read, he does try to make these distinctions of not using, for example, the word I for the self, and all these prepositions which he uses to kind of avoid improper metaphors. For example, spatial metaphors, he avoids that, but here he lets it, he lets these trains of thought kind of intrude here. Yeah, it's a frustrating read, because I feel like you're constantly unsure if you are getting the meaning, because simultaneously I feel like every sentence is very much pregnant with meaning. Like he must be saying something here. Others you can't really decipher. At least me personally, like I just wrote for some chapter, for some paragraphs, like, this makes no sense to me. And then you're not sure, is he that deep, or is he being very very cavalier about the way he expresses himself? It's really nice if we try to pinpoint things more clearly, but perhaps this is a necessary part of the method, like the way Heidegger tried to invent a new kind of language to describe human existence. I have to move on from Plessner soon because I'm starting to dream about him. Any other thoughts, or should we call it a day?
Yeah. Thanks for the
Okay, so
discussion.
it was a great discussion, and see you next week, hopefully. Take
See you
care.
soon. Bye.